The rain had stopped an hour ago, but Leilani Nakamura still felt soaked to the bone. She sat on the cold metal bench at the bus stop, her wet hair sticking to her face as she stared at the crumpled piece of paper in her hands. The red letters seemed to glow in the dim streetlight. Final notice. Eviction proceedings to begin in 72 hours. 72 hours. 3 days to find money she didn't have, for a place she could barely afford to keep anyway. She folded the notice and shoved it into her backpack, right next to her marine biology textbook. The same textbook she'd bought used with coffee stains on page 43 and someone else's notes scribbled in the margins. It had cost her 2 weeks of lunch money, but she needed it for her final exam next week. A car drove by, its headlights cutting through the darkness before disappearing around the corner. Leilani checked her phone. 9:47 p.m. The last bus would come in 13 minutes. After that, she'd have to walk the 8 miles back to her tiny studio apartment. The same apartment she might not have much longer. 6 months ago, everything had been different. Not easy, but different. Grandma Rose had been there, sitting in her favorite chair by the window, always ready with a warm meal and words of encouragement when Leilani came home exhausted from her classes at the community college. The old woman had raised her since she was 12, after Leilani's parents died in that car accident on the Poly Highway. Rose had been her anchor, her cheerleader, her everything. "You're going to be somebody special, Lonnie," she used to say, using the nickname only she was allowed to use. "You're going to help save our ocean. I can see it in your eyes," but Grandma Rose wasn't there anymore. The cancer had taken her quickly, too quickly for Leilani to really prepare for what came after. The medical bills, the funeral costs, the sudden reality of being completely alone at 19 years old. The small inheritance Rose had left behind barely covered the debts. And suddenly Leilani found herself working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Every morning at 5 a.m., she was at the Sunrise Cafe, making coffee for tourists who complained when their lattes weren't hot enough. She'd smile and apologize, knowing she needed every dollar from tips to survive. After her classes in the afternoon, she'd rush to her second job at the hotel, cleaning rooms until her back ached and her hands were raw from the cleaning chemicals. The schedule was killing her slowly. Her grades had started slipping. Last semester she'd been on the dean's list. This semester she was barely passing. Her professors had noticed. Professor Martinez had even pulled her aside after class last week. "Leilani, what's going on?" he had asked, concern written all over his face. "Your last paper was—" Well, it wasn't like you at all. She'd mumbled something about being busy and hurried away before he could see her eyes well up with tears. How could she explain that she'd written that paper at 2 a.m. after a 12-hour day, fighting to keep her eyes open? How could she tell him that sometimes she was so tired she couldn't even remember what she'd studied the night before? The worst part was knowing how disappointed Grandma Rose would be. Not angry, never angry. Rose had never been the type to get mad. But disappointed? That would hurt more than any anger ever could. "Education is the key, Lonnie," Rose used to tell her. "Nobody can ever take that away from you. Not your looks, not your youth, not your money. But what you learn, that's yours forever." Leilani had believed it then. She still wanted to believe it now. But it was hard to think about marine biology and coral reefs when you couldn't afford to eat lunch 3 days a week. It was hard to dream about becoming a scientist when you were one missed paycheck away from living on the beach. That morning had started like any other terrible day. The alarm hadn't gone off because she'd forgotten to charge her phone. She'd overslept and had to run to the cafe, arriving 15 minutes late to find her manager, Dave, waiting with crossed arms and a scowl. "This is the 3rd time this month. Nakamura," he'd said, not caring that other customers could hear. "I can't keep covering for you." She'd apologized and promised it wouldn't happen again, knowing full well that promises didn't change the fact that she was falling apart. The morning rush had been particularly brutal. A man in an expensive suit had yelled at her because his order took too long, calling her incompetent loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. A woman had sent back her breakfast sandwich 3 times, claiming it wasn't perfect enough. By the time her shift ended, Leilani felt like she'd been through a war. Classes hadn't been much better. She'd dozed off during her chemistry lecture and woken up to find half the students gone, and the professor looking at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance. The lab assignment she'd turned in was wrong. She knew it was wrong even as she handed it in, but there hadn't been time to fix it. The breaking point had come at her second job. Mrs. Patterson, one of the regular guests at the hotel, had left a particularly nasty mess in her room. There were towels everywhere, food ground into the carpet, and what looked like an entire bottle of shampoo spilled across the bathroom floor. It had taken Leilani 45 minutes to clean, putting her behind schedule for the rest of her shift. As she was finishing up the room, her phone had buzzed. A text from her landlord. Simple and to the point. Rent is 3 days late. Pay by Friday or face eviction. She'd stood there in that hotel bathroom, surrounded by the smell of industrial cleaning products, and felt something inside her just break. The tears had come then, and once they started, she couldn't make them stop. Her supervisor had found her crying in the supply closet 20 minutes later. "I think you need to go home, honey," the woman had said gently. "You're not in any shape to work today." Going home early meant losing hours she desperately needed. But Leilani was too exhausted to argue. She'd gathered her things and walked out into the humid Hawaiian evening, feeling like a failure in every possible way. The walk to the bus stop had felt endless. Every step reminded her of how far she'd fallen from the dreams she'd once carried. The little girl who used to spend hours exploring tide pools with her grandmother, learning about sea creatures and coral reefs, seemed like a stranger now. That girl had believed she could change the world. This girl could barely change her own circumstances. Now she sat at the bus stop, watching the minutes tick by on her phone. 9:52 p.m., the bus would be here soon. Then she'd go back to her empty apartment. Maybe try to study for a few hours before collapsing into bed, and wake up tomorrow to do it all over again. Unless, of course, she didn't have an apartment to go back to. The tears started again, hot and angry this time. She was tired of crying, tired of struggling, tired of pretending everything was okay when her whole world was falling apart piece by piece. In the distance, she could hear the rumble of the approaching bus. The bus never came. Leilani sat there until 10:30, watching other cars drive past before finally accepting that she'd have to walk home. She shouldered her backpack and started down the empty street, her flip-flops making soft slapping sounds against the wet pavement. She'd made it about 6 blocks when she heard a car slowing down behind her. Her whole body tensed. Walking alone at night wasn't exactly safe, especially not on this stretch of road where the streetlights were few and far between. The car pulled up alongside her, and she kept her eyes straight ahead, walking faster. "Excuse me, miss?" The voice was older, with a thick southern accent that sounded completely out of place in Hawaii. Despite herself, Leilani glanced over. The car was a white rental sedan, and behind the wheel sat a man who looked to be in his 50s. He had graying hair, kind eyes, and was wearing a simple polo shirt that looked expensive but not flashy. "Are you all right, honey?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I saw you back at the bus stop and you looked pretty upset." Leilani's first instinct was to keep walking. Grandma Rose had always taught her to be careful around strangers, especially men she didn't know. But something about this guy seemed different. Maybe it was the genuine concern in his voice, or the fact that he'd kept a respectful distance between his car and the sidewalk. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice cracked on the word fine, making it obvious she was anything but. The man put his car in park and turned off the engine. "You know, I've got 2 daughters about your age back home in Texas, and if either of them was walking alone at night looking as upset as you do, I'd hope some decent person would stop to check on them." He got out of the car, but stayed by the driver's door, giving her space. He was tall and solid-looking, with the kind of build that suggested he'd done manual labor at some point in his life, even though his clothes suggested he didn't anymore. "Name's Jim Patterson," he said, extending his hand but not moving closer. "I'm just here on vacation trying to figure out why people say Hawaii is so relaxing when I can't seem to sit still for 5 minutes." Despite everything, Leilani found herself almost smiling. Almost. "Look, I know you don't know me from Adam," Jim continued, "and your mama probably taught you not to talk to strangers. Mine sure did, but you've been crying and you're walking alone at night, and every instinct I've got is telling me you could use some help." "I don't need help," Leilani said automatically, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Jim studied her for a moment. "When's the last time you ate something?" The question caught her off guard. "What? Food? When? Did you last have a real meal?" Leilani tried to remember. She'd grabbed a banana that morning before work, but that was 14 hours ago? Maybe 15. The hotel where she worked had a cafeteria, but employee meals cost money she didn't have to spare. I ate, she said weakly. Uh-huh. Jim's expression suggested he didn't believe her for a second. There's a diner about 2 blocks from here that stays open all night. How about you let me buy you some dinner, and we can talk about whatever's got you so torn up. I don't take charity, Leilani said quickly. Good for you. Neither do I. Jim's voice was firm but not unkind. But this isn't charity. This is one human being helping another human being, which is how the world's supposed to work. Leilani hesitated. Every smart part of her brain was screaming not to get in a car with a stranger. But the tired, hungry, desperate part of her brain was louder, and there was something about Jim Patterson that reminded her of her grandfather, whom she barely remembered but who had always made her feel safe in the few memories she had of him. Just dinner? She asked. Just dinner. And if you want to leave at any point, I'll drive you wherever you need to go. No questions asked. The diner Jim had mentioned was a small, brightly lit place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. The kind of place where the coffee was strong. The portions were generous and nobody asked too many questions about why you were there at nearly 11 o'clock at night. They took a booth in the back corner. Jim ordered coffee and a slice of pie. Leilani, despite her earlier protests about not needing help, found herself ordering a cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate milkshake. Her stomach was growling so loudly she was embarrassed. So, Jim said once the waitress had left, want to tell me what's got you so upset? Why do you care? The question came out sharper than Leilani had intended, but Jim didn't seem offended. Fair question. He stirred sugar into his coffee, thinking, I guess because I've been where you are. Not exactly where you are, but close enough. You've been evicted? Leilani asked, then immediately regretted sharing that detail. Jim's eyebrows went up slightly, but he didn't pounce on the information. Not evicted, no. But I've been broke. I've been scared. I've been young and alone and feeling like the whole world was against me. And now you're rich and successful and driving around Hawaii in a rental car, Leilani said, unable to keep the bitterness out of her voice. Now I'm rich and successful and driving around Hawaii in a rental car, Jim agreed. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten what it felt like to count pennies for bus fare. The food arrived faster than Leilani had expected. The cheeseburger was huge, and she realized she was actually drooling a little as the waitress set it down in front of her. She tried to eat slowly to maintain some dignity, but she was so hungry that she ended up devouring half of it in the first few minutes. Jim watched her eat without comment, sipping his coffee and occasionally taking small bites of his apple pie. When she finally slowed down, he spoke again. Feel better? Yeah, Leilani admitted. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Now comes the part where I ask nosy questions and you decide whether to answer them or tell me to mind my own business. Despite everything, Leilani found herself smiling for real this time. Ask away. You're in school? Community college. Marine biology. She paused. Or I was. I might have to drop out. Because of the eviction? Leilani nodded, surprised at how easy it was to talk to this stranger. Maybe it was because he wasn't from here. Wasn't part of her world. Maybe it was because he'd fed her. Or maybe it was just because she was so tired of carrying everything alone. What happened to your family? Jim asked gently. Grandma Rose died 6 months ago. She was all I had left. The words came out in a rush along with more tears. My parents died in a car accident when I was 12. Rose raised me. She always said I was going to be somebody special, that I was going to help save the ocean, but I can't even save myself. Jim handed her a napkin. Tell me about the marine biology. For the next 20 minutes, Leilani found herself talking about coral reefs and ocean acidification and the research she'd hoped to do someday. Jim listened intently, asking smart questions that showed he was really paying attention. It felt good to talk about her dreams instead of her problems, even though the dreams felt impossibly far away now. You're passionate about it, Jim observed when she paused to take a sip of her milkshake. I was. I am, she shrugged helplessly. It's hard to think about saving coral reefs when you're about to be homeless. Jim was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup around and around in his hands. When he looked up, his expression was serious. Can I tell you something, Leilani? And I want you to really listen to what I'm saying. She nodded. I grew up poor in East Texas. My daddy worked in the oil fields, and my mama cleaned houses for rich folks. We lived in a trailer that leaked when it rained and had no air conditioning in the summer. I was the first person in my family to graduate high school. And that only happened because a teacher named Mrs. Rodriguez refused to let me quit when I wanted to drop out and get a job. He leaned forward slightly. I know what it's like to have big dreams and no money to chase them with. I know what it's like to feel like the whole world is set up to keep people like you from succeeding. But you made it, Leilani said. I made it, but not alone. And not without help from people who didn't have any good reason to help me, except that they thought I was worth helping. Jim reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to her. I want to help you, Leilani. And before you say anything about charity or handouts, let me tell you exactly what I mean. Leilani stared at the business card Jim had placed on the table. The fancy lettering read, Patterson Energy Solutions with Jim's name underneath and a Houston address. There were phone numbers, email addresses, and a website. It looked expensive and official, the kind of card that belonged to someone who made important decisions in air-conditioned offices. You're serious, she said, looking up at him. You actually run an oil company. I do. Started it 15 years ago with a loan I had no business getting and a dream that was probably too big for a kid from nowhere. Jim picked up the card and turned it over in his hands. But that's not why I want to help you. Leilani waited, not sure what to say. The thing about success, Jim continued, is that it changes you in ways you don't expect. Not all bad ways, mind you. But when you go from counting pennies to having more money than you know what to do with, you start seeing the world differently. He gestured around the diner, with its cracked vinyl seats and flickering fluorescent lights. Most people in my position wouldn't be caught dead in a place like this. They'd drive right past a girl crying at a bus stop without even slowing down. And you know what? There was a time I might have done the same thing. But you didn't, Leilani pointed out. No, I didn't. Because about 5 years ago, something happened that reminded me where I came from. Jim's expression grew distant, like he was looking at something far away. I was driving through East Texas, going to visit a potential drilling site. Took a wrong turn and ended up in the town where I grew up. Place looked exactly the same as when I left it 25 years earlier. Same rundown houses, same people struggling to get by. He paused to take a sip of coffee. I stopped at the old high school, just for nostalgia's sake. And there was Mrs. Rodriguez still teaching after all these years, still trying to convince kids like me that they could be something more than what their circumstances suggested. The teacher who helped you graduate? The very same. 83 years old and still showing up every day, still believing in kids that nobody else believed in. Jim's voice grew soft. She told me about all the students she'd lost over the years. Bright kids, talented kids, kids with dreams as big as mine had been, but they didn't have anyone to give them a chance. Leilani felt something heavy settling in her chest. She thought about Professor Martinez, about the concern in his voice when he'd asked what was wrong, about all the teachers at the community college who still believed in their students, even when those students were falling asleep in class from exhaustion. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me something that day that I haven't been able to get out of my head. Jim continued. She said, Jimmy, you remember what it felt like to have someone believe in you when nobody else would. When are you going to be that person for someone else? And you think I'm that someone else? Jim looked directly at her. I think you're exactly that someone else. The diner was quiet except for the soft clatter of dishes in the kitchen and the hum of the old air conditioner. Leilani found herself staring at her hands, trying to process what Jim was suggesting. Here's what I'm proposing, Jim said, his voice becoming more businesslike. I pay for you to finish your education, not just community college. University, bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD if that's what you want. Tuition, books, living expenses, everything. Leilani's head snapped up. What? You heard me right. Full ride. All the way through whatever degree you need to become the marine biologist you want to be. That's impossible. That would cost more money than you've ever seen in your life, Jim agreed, but not more money than I can afford. And definitely not more money than it's worth to help someone who could actually make a difference in the world. Leilani felt dizzy. The numbers were swirling in her head, but she couldn't make them make sense. A bachelor's degree at the University of Hawaii would cost at least $60,000. A master's degree, maybe another 40. A PhD? She didn't even know, but it had to be enormous. This is crazy, she whispered. Is it? Let me tell you what's really crazy. Jim's voice grew stronger. It's crazy that a girl as smart and passionate as you are might have to give up her dreams because she can't afford to chase them. It's crazy that we live in a world where talent and hard work aren't enough, where you need money just to get the chance to prove yourself. But why me? You don't even know me. I know enough. Jim counted on his fingers. I know you're working 2 jobs while going to school. I know you're trying to support yourself while grieving the loss of the only family you had left. I know you care enough about marine biology to talk about coral reefs with passion, even when you're exhausted and heartbroken. And I know you're stubborn enough to say no to help because you don't want to take charity. He leaned back in his seat. That tells me you're exactly the kind of person worth investing in. Investing in? Leilani repeated the phrase. That's what this is. An investment. In you, in your future, in the work you'll do someday to help save the oceans. Jim's eyes were serious. But here's the catch. I'm not doing this out of the goodness of my heart, and I'm not doing it for free. Leilani felt her stomach drop. Of course there was a catch. There was always a catch. What do you want? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I want you to promise me 2 things, Jim said. First, I want you to work as hard as you can. I want you to take this opportunity and run with it. To become the best marine biologist you can possibly be. No wasting time, no giving up when things get difficult. That seemed reasonable enough. And the second thing, I want you to pay it forward. What do you mean? I mean that someday when you're successful and established in your career, I want you to find someone else who needs help. Someone like you were tonight, and I want you to give them the same chance I'm giving you. Leilani sat back in the booth, feeling overwhelmed. The offer was so big, so impossible that her brain couldn't quite accept it as real. People didn't just offer to pay for strangers' educations. Things like that didn't happen to girls like her. I can't, she said finally. Why not? Because, she struggled to find the words. Because what if I fail? What if you spend all that money on me and I can't handle the pressure? What if I'm not as smart as you think I am? Jim smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked truly amused. Honey, you're working 2 jobs while going to school and still worried about failing. You've been keeping yourself afloat for 6 months after losing the most important person in your life. If that's not proof that you can handle pressure, I don't know what is. But the money is just money. I made it once, I can make it again. But your potential? Your dreams, your chance to make a real difference in the world, those things are irreplaceable. Leilani felt tears starting again, but these were different from the desperate tears at the bus stop. These felt like hope, scary and fragile and almost too big to hold. I need to think about it, she said. Of course you do. This is a big decision. Jim reached into his wallet again and pulled out several $20 bills. But while you're thinking, let me take care of your rent problem. Consider it an advance on your future success. I can't take that. Yes, you can. And you will. Because right now you need help and I can help you. Tomorrow, you can start thinking about all the reasons why this won't work. But tonight you're going to go home to an apartment that's still yours and get a good night's sleep. He stood up and left the money on the table along with his business card. Call me tomorrow, Leilani. Or the day after. Or whenever you're ready to talk about changing your life. As he walked toward the door, he turned back one more time. And Leilani, your grandmother was right. You are going to be somebody special. Leilani stared at Jim's business card for 3 days straight. She kept it on her tiny kitchen table next to her textbooks and unpaid bills, like it was some kind of magical object that might disappear if she looked away too long. On the 4th day, she finally worked up the courage to call. Patterson Energy Solutions, came a crisp voice on the other end. I'm looking for Jim Patterson. My name is Leilani Nakamura. He told me to call. Oh, you're the girl from Hawaii. Mr. Patterson has been hoping to hear from you. Hold on just 1 second. Before Leilani could process the fact that Jim's secretary knew who she was, Jim's familiar voice came on the line. Leilani, I was starting to worry you'd decided I was just some crazy old man. I did think that for a while, she admitted and heard him laugh. Fair enough. Have you made your decision? Leilani took a deep breath. I want to say yes, but I'm scared. Good. If you weren't scared, I'd be worried you didn't understand what you were getting into. That conversation led to a second one, and then a third. Jim flew back to Hawaii 2 weeks later, not for vacation this time, but to help Leilani figure out the practical details of completely changing her life. They met at the same diner where he'd made his offer. This time Leilani wasn't crying. She'd showered, put on her best shirt, and even managed to eat breakfast before coming. It was amazing what having your rent paid could do for your confidence. "So I've been doing some research," Jim said, spreading papers across their table. "The University of Hawaii has an excellent marine biology program. They've got research partnerships with the National Marine Sanctuary, access to some of the best coral reef systems in the Pacific, and professors who are doing exactly the kind of work you want to do." Leilani looked at the application materials he'd brought. Everything seemed so official, so real. "What if they don't accept me?" "They'll accept you. Your grades from community college are excellent, despite everything you've been dealing with. And I may have made a small donation to their marine science department that came with a strong recommendation for a particular student I know." "Jim, you can't just buy my way into college." "I'm not buying your way in. I'm making sure you get the chance to prove yourself. There's a difference." The application process was more complicated than anything Leilani had ever done. There were essays to write, transcripts to request, recommendation letters to ask for. Jim helped her with every step, sometimes flying back to Hawaii just to drive her to appointments or help her practice for interviews. Professor Martinez wrote her a recommendation letter that made her cry. "Leilani Nakamura is one of the most dedicated students I have encountered in 20 years of teaching," it began. "Despite facing extraordinary personal challenges, she has maintained both academic excellence and an infectious passion for marine science that inspires everyone around her." The acceptance letter came on a Tuesday in March. Leilani was working at the hotel when her phone buzzed with an email notification. She almost dropped her cleaning cart when she saw the subject line: "Congratulations from the University of Hawaii Marine Biology Department." She called Jim immediately, not caring that it was barely 6 a.m. in Texas. "I got in," she said when he answered, her voice shaking. "Jim, I got in." "Of course you did," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. I never doubted it for a second." Moving from her tiny studio apartment to a real dorm room felt like moving to another planet. Leilani had never lived around so many people her own age, had never had access to a real library with thousands of books, had never walked across a campus where everyone seemed to know exactly what they wanted to do with their lives. The first semester was overwhelming. The classes were harder than anything she'd experienced at community college. The other students seemed so confident, so prepared. Many of them had grown up planning to attend university, had parents who'd helped them navigate the system. Leilani felt lost most of the time. Jim called her every Sunday, without fail. Sometimes they talked for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. He never asked about her grades or whether she was studying hard enough. Instead, he asked about her classes, what she was learning, whether she'd made any friends. "I don't fit in here," she confessed during one of their calls in October. "Everyone else seems so sure of themselves. I feel like I'm pretending to belong." "You know what I learned in my first year running a business?" Jim asked. "Everyone's pretending, at least a little bit. The difference between people who succeed and people who don't isn't confidence. It's persistence. What if I'm not smart enough?" "Leilani, you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether you're smart enough. The question is whether you care enough. And I've never met anyone who cares about the ocean the way you do." He was right. When Leilani got into the actual marine biology coursework, everything started clicking. She spent hours in the lab, learning to identify different species of coral, studying water chemistry, understanding the complex relationships that kept reef ecosystems alive. Her first research project was a study of coral bleaching in Kaneohe Bay. She spent entire days snorkeling over reefs, taking photographs, collecting water samples, measuring pH levels. It was exhausting work, but for the first time in years, she woke up excited about what she was going to do that day. Professor Chen, who supervised her research, noticed her dedication immediately. "You have an intuitive understanding of marine systems," she told Leilani after a particularly successful day in the field. "I've seen students with twice your academic background who don't have half your instincts." By her second year, Leilani wasn't just keeping up with her classmates. She was leading study groups, helping other students with their research, presenting her own findings at undergraduate conferences. The girl who had once been too tired to stay awake in chemistry class was now publishing papers with her professors. Jim visited Hawaii twice a year, always timing his trips around Leilani's major presentations or research milestones. He never made a big deal about the money he was spending on her education, but he always wanted to hear about her work in detail. Tell me about this coral nursery project you're working on, he said during one visit, as they sat on the beach near the university. Leilani launched into an explanation of how damaged coral could be grown in protected nurseries and then transplanted back to degraded reefs. She talked about growth rates and survival percentages and genetic diversity. Jim listened intently, asking questions that showed he was really trying to understand. You know, he said when she finished, when I first met you, you were so passionate about this stuff that you could make coral sound interesting even when you were exhausted and heartbroken. But listening to you now, it's like watching someone speak their native language. I feel like I've found where I'm supposed to be, Leilani said. Like everything that happened before was just preparing me for this. Jim smiled. That's exactly how I felt when I drilled my first successful well. Like all the years of struggle suddenly made sense. Their relationship had evolved over the 3 years from benefactor and recipient to something that felt more like family. Jim never tried to replace Grandma Rose, but he filled a similar role in Leilani's life. He was someone who believed in her completely, who celebrated her successes and helped her work through her failures. You know what the best part is? Jim asked during that same beach conversation. What? Watching you become the person you were always meant to be. When I met you at that bus stop, you had all this potential locked up inside you. All I did was give you the key. By her 3rd year, Leilani was working on research that was getting attention from scientists around the world. Her study of coral resilience in warming waters had been accepted for publication in a major marine biology journal. She'd been offered internships at research stations in Australia and the Maldives. The girl who had once worried about having enough money for lunch was now presenting her research at international conferences, collaborating with experts from universities across the globe. But the thing that made her happiest wasn't the recognition or the opportunities. It was the knowledge that she was actually making a difference. Her research was contributing to real solutions for coral reef conservation. The dreams that Grandma Rose had encouraged, the passion that had sustained her through the darkest times, had turned into work that mattered. I've been thinking about what you said, she told Jim during one of their regular Sunday calls. About paying it forward. Oh yeah? What about it? I think I know what I want to do. When I finish my PhD, I want to start a scholarship program for students like me, kids who have the passion and the talent but not the resources. Jim was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Leilani, that might be the best idea you've ever had. Will you help me figure out how to make it work? Honey, Jim said, I wouldn't miss it for the world. Dr. Leilani Nakamura adjusted her graduation cap one more time and looked out at the crowd gathering for the University of Hawaii's commencement ceremony. 7 years had passed since that terrible night at the bus stop, and sometimes it still felt like a dream. You ready for this? Asked her friend Katie, who was graduating with her PhD in marine biology on the same day. They'd become close over the past 4 years, bonding over late nights in the lab and early mornings diving on research sites. I think so, Leilani said, though her hands were shaking slightly. It's just surreal, you know? Sometimes I still can't believe I made it here. Are you kidding? You didn't just make it here. You crushed it. Your research on coral restoration techniques is being implemented in 3 different countries now. Leilani smiled, thinking about the coral nurseries being established using her methods in the Philippines, the Maldives, and the Caribbean. Her dissertation had become the foundation for new approaches to reef conservation that were actually working, actually making a difference. In the crowd, she spotted Jim immediately. He was impossible to miss, not because of his size but because of the huge grin on his face and the way he was pointing her out to the woman sitting next to him. Is that your Texas millionaire? Katie asked, following her gaze. That's him, and the woman next to him is his wife. Beth, she flew in from Houston just for this. He looks like a proud dad. He kind of is, Leilani said softly. The ceremony felt endless, but finally they called her name. Dr. Leilani Nakamura, PhD in marine biology, summa cum laude. She walked across that stage with her head high, thinking about Grandma Rose, about the dreams they'd shared sitting by the window in that tiny apartment. When she reached the dean, he shook her hand and leaned in close. Dr. Nakamura, your work is going to change the world. I hope you know that. After the ceremony, Jim practically lifted her off the ground in a bear hug. I am so proud of you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Rose would be over the moon right now. Beth hugged her next, wiping tears from her eyes. Jimmy's told me so much about you over the years. It's like meeting a daughter I've only heard about in stories. They had dinner that night at a fancy restaurant overlooking Waikiki Beach. Jim insisted on ordering champagne, even though Leilani reminded him she still didn't really drink. Tonight's an exception, he said. Tonight we're celebrating 7 years of the hardest work I've ever seen anyone do. 7 years of the best investment you've ever made. You mean, Leilani corrected him. The returns have definitely exceeded my expectations, Jim agreed with a grin. Over dinner, they talked about the scholarship program they'd been planning. Jim had connected Leilani with lawyers and accountants to help set up the foundation properly. They'd decided to call it the Second Chances Scholarship Fund, and they were planning to launch it with enough money to help 20 students in the first year. I've been thinking about the selection criteria, Leilani said, pulling out a notebook she'd been carrying around for months. Obviously, we want academic potential, but more than that, I want to find kids who have that spark, that passion for something bigger than themselves, like a 19-year-old who could talk about coral reefs even when she was crying at a bus stop, Jim suggested. Exactly like that. The first recipient of the Second Chances Scholarship was a boy named David Chen. He was 18, working at a grocery store to help support his single mother, and dreaming of becoming an environmental engineer. His application essay was about wanting to design systems to clean plastic out of the ocean, and it reminded Leilani so much of herself that she knew immediately he was their first scholarship student. They met David at a coffee shop near his high school, the same way Jim had first really talked to Leilani at that diner 7 years earlier. The kid was nervous just like she had been, suspicious of help that seemed too good to be true. Why me? David asked, echoing the same question Leilani had asked Jim all those years ago. Because you remind us of someone we used to know, Leilani said with a smile, someone who needed a chance to prove what she was capable of. Jim nodded. And because we believe that when you're successful, you'll find someone else who needs help and you'll pay it forward. David's story was different from Leilani's, but the core was the same. A bright kid with big dreams and no resources to chase them, working multiple jobs, watching his grades slip because he was exhausted, wondering if he'd ever get the chance to make something of himself. By the end of their second year, the Second Chances Scholarship Fund was helping 43 students. They had kids studying everything from renewable energy to sustainable agriculture to marine biology like Leilani. Each one was chosen not just for their academic ability, but for their passion and their commitment to making the world better. Leilani had taken a position as a research professor at the University of Hawaii, splitting her time between teaching, research, and running the scholarship program. Jim had semi-retired, spending more time in Hawaii and becoming deeply involved in the day-to-day operations of the foundation. You know what I love about this? Jim said one day as they reviewed applications in Leilani's office. Every one of these kids is going to change the world in ways we can't even imagine yet. And every one of them is going to help someone else someday, Leilani added. That's the part that really gets me. We're not just helping 43 students. We're creating a chain reaction that could help thousands of people over the years. 3 years after the program launched, their first group of scholarship recipients was graduating. David Chen had not only finished his environmental engineering degree, but had already designed a new type of ocean cleanup system that was being tested by environmental groups around the world. At the scholarship program's annual celebration, David stood up to speak to the newer recipients. 3 years ago, I was working at a grocery store and wondering if I'd ever get to college, he said. Dr. Nakamura and Mr. Patterson didn't just give me money for school. They gave me hope. They showed me that there are people in the world who believe in investing in others, not for profit, but because they understand that lifting each other up is how we all succeed. He paused, looking directly at Leilani and Jim. And now I have an announcement. I've decided to donate half of my first year's salary to the Second Chances Scholarship Fund, so we can help even more students next year. The room erupted in applause, but Leilani barely heard it. She was thinking about Grandma Rose, about that night at the bus stop, about the chain of kindness that had started with one person caring enough to stop and help. After the celebration, Jim found her standing outside looking up at the stars. What are you thinking about? He asked. I'm thinking about how weird life is, Leilani said. 7 years ago, I thought my life was over. I was 19 years old and I couldn't see any way forward. And now you're Dr. Nakamura, internationally recognized coral reef expert and founder of a scholarship program that's changing lives across the country. And now I understand what you meant about paying it forward, she said. It's not just about helping the next person in line. It's about creating a culture where helping each other is normal, where success means lifting others up, not just climbing higher yourself. Jim smiled. You know, when I first saw you at that bus stop, I thought I was helping one person. I had no idea I was actually starting a movement. Maybe that's how all movements start, Leilani said. One person deciding to care about a stranger. A few months later, Leilani received a letter that made her cry happy tears. It was from a girl named Isabella Rodriguez, one of their newest scholarship recipients, who was studying marine biology at UC San Diego. Dear Dr. Nakamura, the letter began. I wanted to tell you that I've decided what I want to do with my life. I want to study coral reefs just like you do. But more than that, I want to help start scholarship programs like yours at other universities, because I understand now that the best way to honor the chance you've given me is to create chances for other people. That evening, Leilani called Jim to read him the letter. You know what this means? Jim asked when she finished. What? It means we're not just changing individual lives anymore. We're changing how people think about success, about responsibility, about what it means to be part of a community. Grandma Rose always said I was going to help save the ocean. Leilani mused. But I think what we're really doing is saving something even more important. What's that? We're saving the idea that people are worth investing in, that everyone deserves a chance. That kindness isn't just nice to have, it's essential. Jim was quiet for a moment. You know, Leilani, I've made a lot of money in my life. I've closed deals worth millions of dollars. But stopping at that bus stop 7 years ago, that's still the best decision I ever made. For me too, Leilani said, looking out at the ocean she'd devoted her life to protecting. For all of us.